Right. I'll start really with what I think is one of the common discourses in Ireland, which is that we are not Greece. This comes up in a whole number of dimensions. When Enda Kenny went to Berlin, I think it was in October of last year, Der Spiegel referred to him as the anti-Papandreou. At that time, Papandreou was the key figure, if you like, making a mess of it from the point of view of the EU and so on. Michael Noonan, at one stage in the Dáil, joked that he would print T-shirts saying Ireland is not Greece, and of course the T-shirts would have to be paid for by the people buying them. So the general view is that Ireland is a very competent, savvy player who follows the rules of the IMF game and the EU game and will be duly rewarded for that, whereas the Greece represents chaos, if you like, pensioners on the streets taking food out of garbage bins, if you like, a disorganised society. And that, I think, is the theme that has been pushed across in Ireland. And that, by the way, also comes from the social democratic left, who argue that if the far left begin to grow in Ireland, what we really want, those of us on the far left, or called the far left, is to produce a Greek-type situation in order to get revolution. So that type of discourse about Ireland not being Greece is pretty common in this country. Now, if we look at the Irish state's response to the crisis, to paraphrase Enda Kenny, there is a 5-point plan of economic strategy, which I've tried to summarise as follows. And I'll just go through each one in turn to indicate why I think this strategy is falling apart and why it has essentially produced greater class polarisation and inequality. Okay, the first element of strategy was obviously to bail out the banks. The main thing just to say about this is that because it has been normalised, and in fact in many ways the conventional media has more or less bracketed off the bank bailout, or as they call it, recapitalisation, interesting new word, that's now passé. We're not supposed to talk about the bank bailout. But the sheer scale of it is astounding, absolutely astounding. It was introduced, of course, by Lenihan famously as the cheapest bank bailout in the world, which probably is a Goebbels-style lie of proportions, for enormous lie, incredible. It's difficult to calculate the exact figures. The figures given in the Dáil recently was about, I think, 60 billion. But if you take into account the probable losses from NAMA, the Standards & Poor's estimate is 90 billion. So 90 billion the bank bailout has cost the Irish population. Now, bank bailouts are not uncommon under capitalism, and in fact they have become increasingly common in the last 20, 30 years. Where you have a bank bailout, where you have a banking collapse, like in Sweden, for example, in the early 90s, it tends to take about 10% of the size of the economy. So 10% of the size of the economy is put into the banking system, subsidising in a magnificent form of corporate welfare, but amounts to about 10%. If we look at the Irish case, it is unbelievable. Maybe the exceptions before Ireland were Indonesia and possibly, for a period, Argentina. The Irish case, the bank bailout comes in at 56% of GDP. Really, probably the dearest bank bailout in world history, and if you actually use GNP figures, even far higher. Okay, so that's the first element of the Irish strategy. The second element of the Irish strategy is that there should be a few hard years of austerity, and once these years were over, a recovery would begin. Now, because I'm deeply sceptical of conventional economists and have a slightly nerdish streak, I often go back and read the ESRI predictions. So if you have spare time in your hands, it's a useful thing to do. And these people get it consistently wrong, According to them, the recovery will be happening just about now, about 2012, beginning of 2013. So the few hard years were supposed to be from 2008, 2009, 2010 maybe. But what we actually find, and their prediction therefore was, that the debt will be manageable because the economy would start to grow by now, and as the economy started to grow, the debt to GDP ratio would decline. However, when you look at the actual cold reality in the light of day, what you find is by the best measure to use in Ireland is gross national product, because it takes out the repatriated profits. Ireland's current level of debt is approximately 150% of GNP. Now, just remember, the Greek debt was, if I remember, 180% of GDP before the write-down. It's down to about 120 now. So this puts Ireland really very close to the top of the EU debt league. But nevertheless, we have these economists who tell us it is manageable. The third element of the strategy, and this is the one bright spark they have on the horizon, is that the way the economy will grow will be through exports. And these are the figures they hold up as the success story. When you actually look at it a bit carefully, what you find is the exports have increased, but fairly marginal. What has decreased has been the imports. Because you have such a deep recession, you're importing less, and that gives you the trade surplus. But nevertheless, in terms of a bright spark, in terms of those running the economy, this is what they point to as the way out of the crisis. But there are a few problems. One of the problems is that the export sector is highly concentrated in chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and medical devices. And because of that concentration, particularly, for example, in the area of pharmaceuticals, there is a problem in terms of the strategy here. The export figures, for example, in December dropped by about 6% because one drug produced by Pfizer went off patent. And therefore, we are, just with the particular, by accident, a lot of the pharmaceutical industry, a number of the drugs will tend to go off patent, which will reduce the Irish export trade. More importantly, the strategy, the export-led strategy, which of course is classic IMF stuff for any country that's in difficulties, forget about domestic demand, focus on exports. The difficulty is that because Ireland, if you like, became the model pupil of austerity, that lesson has been generalised throughout Europe, and therefore the austerity has driven Europe essentially back into recession, making an export strategy more difficult to implement. The fourth element of the strategy was pay cuts. And again, here's that guru of conventional economists, John Fitzgerald. He says, if this is him writing in 2009, if the cuts in the public sector can be mirrored in the private sector, there will be a big reduction in unemployment after 3 or 4 years. I mean, these people are taken seriously. I don't know why they're taken seriously. So 3 or 4 years, that's 2012, there'll be a big reduction in unemployment. Unemployment's gone up to 500,000, and yet this man still comes up in the airwaves. His predictions are taken seriously, and this is consistently this sort of pattern from the ESRI. So first of all, completely wrong prediction in terms of what would happen if there was pay cuts, and then rather just to distort his theory even more, as it happens, the export success from the three industries I was talking about happens to come from the industries that pay above the average. So the idea that you cut pay in order to increase exports, there's no relationship. The higher paid industries are those with the most success in terms of exports. Here's a learned professor from Trinity College. I mean, this is astounding stuff. This is him writing in the Irish Independent. The cross-country evidence from the Great Depression, unambiguous. There's no question about it. The more wages fell during the 1930s, the less output declined. I mean, this is just extraordinary stuff. The idea you cut wages, the economy began to increase in America. I mean, right? When you actually look at the facts of it, cutting wages in Ireland has meant a massive shrinkage in domestic demand, and as a result, right, the most recent figures show, when you look at GNP, Ireland is still in recession. Okay, so the strategy is not working. It's just not working, despite all the learned professors of economics who make that point. Now, how did they get away with it? I mean, how did they get away with this conflict when even the simplest examination shows it is falling apart? And this is where I just want to look at the role of professional economists and the manner in which the population of Ireland have been mystified by what I call the secular priesthood, who claim to have the capacity to interpret markets and to produce a sort of a techno-fatalistic type of discourse where nothing can be done, any, if you like, challenge from the left is totally unrealistic, not possible, and so on. How has that happened? And I think it's happened through a number of ways. If you just look at it from the academic end, first of all, in Irish economics, there has been an intellectual cleansing of Keynesian economics. Irish economics departments are predominantly neoliberal, fanatically neoliberal. The university generally has promoted people who are conformist in terms of thinking, who are tied into the priorities of the ruling elite. Professors in Ireland are relatively highly paid. There's a material basis for the type of discourse that is produced in academia, and therefore what you get is what people like Habermas called sort of justification by technical rationality. This is what we have here that is promoted and constantly put across the Irish media. And as an example of this type of discourse, which you'll become more familiar with this as the fiscal treaty emerges, is this notion of the structural deficit. And the discourse that is promoted in the media generally is, forget about the bank bailout, that's passé, we're not supposed to talk about that. Talk about the 18 billion, or now I think they're now claiming it's 13 billion deficit. And any time a left-winger appears on the media, the question is always, very interesting, but what are we going to do about the deficit, the structural deficit? So this is the way it's framed. And of course, when you think about it, I mean, there's a few problems with that way of framing it. Two problems in particular. First of all, the we word. You never had I can't remember anybody on the media during the Celtic Tiger saying, what are we going to do about the surplus? And I never heard that question asked in the Celtic Tiger years, but suddenly we comes in the recession. Isn't that strange? But more importantly is the concept of the structural deficit is something that is unrelated to the bank bailout. It's an entirely separate issue. It has nothing to do with the fact we've put in money into the bank bailout, but yet we're left with this shortfall, which is, as I said, unrelated to the bank bailout. Now, the problem here is, if a state decides to put vast amounts of money into a bank bailout, it means that money is not available for other economic strategies. You can't entirely separate the question. More importantly, you can't separate the question from what private investors are doing. Are they investing? Are they not investing? So it's set up as an isolated problem which the left is then asked to address in isolation without referring to, if you like, how the capitalists are behaving in terms of investment. So this is a mystification. It's a mystification in order to confine the type of alternatives to a very narrow range. Why will you find this mystification will dominate your life over the next month? Because it is core to the fiscal treaty. Fiscal treaty is about putting into the Irish Constitution the concept of the structural deficit. Now, the Irish Constitution, to the best of my knowledge, already has one very fuzzy concept. It's a reference to, I think, the Most Holy Trinity. You're going to get a second one, which is called the structural deficit. And it is equally metaphysical. They don't know what it is. Let me quote a real authority, the German Bundesbank. They're the people who are very important people now. They say the concept of a structural deficit is them talking to themselves, is relatively complex, opaque, and this is an interesting one, elastic on account of the numerous discretionary modelling options. That means you'll get different answers depending which measure you choose to use. That's what it means, okay? And just to illustrate why this is this mystical concept, when the IMF examined the Irish economy in 2007, when Irish economy was the poster boy or girl of the world economies, the structural deficit was in surplus. We were doing fine. Everything was great in 2007, and they gave a score of 0.7. When they went back to examine it 2 years afterwards, they said, oh, sorry, we got it wrong. The structural deficit was minus 8.7. I mean, this is bullshit. You can't be more polite. This is total and utter rubbish, right? But this concept, we put into the Irish Constitution, is a concept used in a mystical way by economists who can only economists can interpret this type of concept. Okay, so this is how it works. So through mystification, technical rationality, fatalism, we are where we are, we have to be realistic, and so on. Therefore, any alternative, bar an intensification of neoliberalism is ruled out in the official discourse. Now, what I want to try to illustrate is this is really a cover for a very nasty class bias. The basis of conventional economists is the atomized individual. Conventional economist doesn't talk about class. Class is not a category in terms of market relations and so on, in terms of conventional economists. So therefore, behind this mystical language is a class war, a war being fought by the wealthy against middle and lower income people in Ireland. Okay, now how might we illustrate this? We can illustrate this first of all by showing how the main brunt of paying for the crisis has been borne by PAYE taxpayers, essentially PAYE taxpayers. Now, some just basic figures. 95% of PAYE taxpayers are below 100,000, earn below 100,000. Nearly 50% in the so-called wealthy economy earn below 30,000. There's a nasty little trick played by the revenue commissioners where they will tell you, oh, but 24% of our taxes come from those earning over 100,000. Not quite true. Tax cases. It's a combination. Most of those are combinations of two incomes, but they use that as a sleight of hand to pretend that those over 100,000 are paying a greater share of taxation and that we couldn't possibly tax people over 100,000 more. But the general point I want to make is, if you have a strategy of dealing with the crisis by increasing taxes on PAYE, by definition, you're essentially hitting middle and lower income people. Now here's a little table I've drawn up from the last few budgets. It's a very crude Marxist table. It's based on looking at the tax adjustments on capital and the tax adjustments on income. In other words, I'm not focusing in on debate. Most debates in Ireland take place between income ranges, and you debate that, but you don't look at the bigger question: where is, are we taking more money from capital, those who live by capital assets, capital use of capital and so on, or those who use by income? And when we look at, on the capital side, I'm including the increases in capital gains tax, capital acquisitions tax, I've been generous, the property tax relief is, and the approved retirement funds. When you look at the actual figures, what you find is about 5 billion has been taken from the PAYE sector and 659 million from capital. The vast majority of the cost of the recession is being taken from those who earn rather than those who live from capital. Secondly, the class bias is indicated in the longer term strategy of the Irish state, which is to shift to indirect taxes. This is the big strategy of the state, in particular shifting to property taxes, water charges, carbon taxes and increased VAT. And you can see some of the projected figures on how they intend to do this. Household charges, this is drawn from the Commission on Taxation. They argue that household charges should go to about 1.1 billion. And in terms of water charges, the general EU directive is full economic costing. Full cost has to be borne by the users, which essentially will take it up to 1 billion. Therefore, this is the general strategy of the Irish state. Now, indirect taxes hit the poor, but just as a general matter of principle. They hit the poor disproportionately. That's, I think, relatively controversial. In terms of international evidence, the poorest 10% pay twice as much in terms of indirect taxes relative to the richest. A study in Ireland done by Barrett and Wall, one of the better ones for the, I think, Combat Poverty Agency, again showed that the lowest decile, the taxes are again about twice that of the upper decile. So indirect taxes of their very nature tend to hit the poor. But of course, what's interesting about Ireland, and probably an effect of social partnership, is people don't tell you we're going to rob you. They never say we're here to rob you, we're here to rob the poor. What they always say is we are here to be progressive. This is progressive. And I mean, what I find quite shocking is how people fall for this very easily. And I think there's been a slight sniffiness about the household charges campaign amongst sections of the more moderate left. It's not quite a progressive activity. This is the far left dabbling in populism And if you like, if you look at, for example, the task, which I think has played a very poor and bad role on this issue. I'm sorry to say that, but I think that's the case. TASC has argued for progressive property charges and also argued for water charges, provided it is linked to income and so on. And this seems to me to just fall for the trap being set by the Irish elite. They have not the slightest intention of, if you like, linking property taxes proportionately to the size of the mansions, or for that matter the cottages. What they will do is, of course there'll be some bands, there'll be a certain amount of, maybe 3 or 4 bands, but in reality most of the money from property charges will come from the, what is it, I think 76% of the Irish population who own a home. Most of it will hit majority and low income people yet again. So it is a regressive taxation, as of course is the tax on water. So this is a strategy of the Irish elite to again hit the majority of the population rather than hit those who have borne it. Thirdly, it's really what I consider a violent class attack, particularly in the last budget, and particularly by that ex-left-winger, Joan Burton, on the poorest sections of society. The last budget took 8.88, sorry, millions, that should be 8, I'm getting my millions and billions figured up, apologies. That should be 812 million was taken out of the social protection budget. But what was interesting was, who was the prime target? And in a variation of the sort of attack on the so-called welfare queens pioneered by Thatcher and Reagan, the primary target, one of the most divisive targets, was on single parents, one-parent families, predominantly, overwhelmingly women. And essentially what Burton has done is to follow the model pioneered by Clinton in America of going after one-parent families, reducing the one-parent families for children, taking down to the age of 7, reducing the income disregard, cutting, if you like, benefits to people on CE schemes and so on. Really a vicious attack on poor people. In addition to that, obviously the attacks on the public services generally will tend to disproportionately hit the poor, those who tend to have less medical insurance and so on. So this is, if you like, very much a class-dominated strategy, a strategy I believe is failing, but very much a class-biased strategy. And again, you can illustrate it. People, you know, the fact the left often gets challenged on these issues. Where's your figures? And you're put on the spot immediately on it. Where's your figures exactly? The figures are there. They're all over the place, right? This is for example, the EU Common Deprivation Index. Common Deprivation Index, the new index from the EU. If you cannot afford 3 essential items, like heating, a second pair of shoes, meat in terms of a family meal, you fit into the Common Deprivation list about 10 or so items. The Common Deprivation Index in Ireland has almost doubled in the last number of years. And yet, when we look at the other side, again, this story from people like, I better not mention any media figures, the story, where's all the wealth gone? But there's no wealth in Ireland, it's gone. I mean, what nonsense. I mean, again, the figures show that net financial assets in Ireland has increased. Now here's in the dry language of the Central Statistics Office. I mean, people tell you there's no wealth. The profits, according to the Central Statistics Office, in 2011, here they are. Notice, I've just read that. This is extraordinary. This is the most damning sentence you can find from an official agency. The profits of non-financial corporations increased from 35 billion to 37 billion. The other main component of value is compensation to employees. Now notice, the profits went up, wages and salaries declined from 37 billion to 34 billion. And it's saying there's a connection. The reason why the profits went up is they cut the wages. That's what's happening. And so on, right? So the idea there's no wealth just doesn't make any sense. And the question therefore is, let's come to the last element of the strategy. By cutting wages, we will send out a signal to investors to come and invest here. By voting yes to the fiscal treaty, we'll send out another signal. By taxing lone parents, another signal to investors. Does it actually happen? No evidence whatsoever. No evidence whatsoever. The Irish capitalist class are on an investment strike. They're not investing in this economy, and they don't intend to invest in this economy for quite some time. They are moving their money out of the economy. elsewhere. And you look at the actual figures, essentially up to 2007, about 48 billion was invested in the Irish economy. Of course, a lot in construction, right? But if you look where we're at now, it's shrunk from 48 billion as an investment by the capitalist class in the economy down to 18 billion. And it's not just a shrinkage in construction, it's a shrinkage in many sectors of the economy. So this idea that the more you give them, the more they will respond by giving jobs, I mean, it's just absurd. And just as a by the way, I mean, it's an extraordinary story in the Irish Times last week, where, if you remember, we were told that in the last budget, a special allowance had to be made for high-flying executives who sent their children to private school, that if they pay a fee of €5,000 to send their children to a private school, they could write that off for tax purposes. That would let them invest in Ireland, right? You then find out last week that the law was written by KPMG. They wrote it, gave it to the minister, and the minister said, okay, we'll give them a tax allowance for private schools. Next time you're going to give them, we might as well throw in a free swimming pool. I mean, it's that crazy. Throw in a free swimming pool and they invest in jobs. It don't work like this, right? So that you actually see the figures in terms of how they're actually behaving at the moment. So from my point of view, I'd like people to come back, and I personally, I've tried to look at it in as unbiased way as possible. I don't see what this revival strategy for Irish capitalism is going to be. I don't see how there could, there's not going to be a Celtic tiger, obviously, but how could there be any serious, sustained boom in this economy in the next 4 to 5 years? I can't see it happening. We're looking at least half a decade. Obviously there'll be some pickup at some stage, but a very serious dislocation of people's lives in terms of capitalism. More generally, I think we've entered a systemic crisis in terms of global capitalism. I mean, the reality is that according to all predictions, according to global capitalism, this was supposed to be a V-type recession, down sharply and up. It's not happening. The recession is continuing, very mild spurts of growth and so on. We're talking about a very difficult situation in terms of Irish capitalism. And therefore, finally, let me indicate what I think is that at this point there is an historic possibility for the left growing, but I would argue on the basis of an understanding of a real possibility in our generation of overturning the rule of capitalism, at least in some parts of the world, and hopefully even in this part of the world. So, given that, what do I think are the strategies of the left? First of all, I think it's absolutely crucial the left moves away from, I think, quite a conservative notion in the 80s of just having single-issue campaigns. We will just focus on one issue. We'll build the broadest base on one issue and just focus on that issue. I think the nature of the capitalist crisis means issues tend to be linked. And if you look at probably the biggest mass movement in Ireland at the moment, the household charge, the general, if you like, trajectory of that is to move into a wider argument against the present policies. I recently spoke at a meeting, found a very interesting meeting in Moat, which I take as a standard example of a household charges campaign. 30 people at a meeting in Moat who meet regularly, average age about 50, who've been involved and dug into a network of fighting the household charges in that town. Of the 30 people, 29 immediately from moving on to campaigning on the fiscal treaty. That is the trajectory. The household charges has been the touchstone on which a lot of other shifts are occurring. So, from my point of view, in a situation where, to quote Jack O'Connor in the Financial Times recently, the unions have been taken out of the equation of protest. That's what Croke Park is all about, taking the unions out of the equation of protest. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the working class abhor a vacuum, and it happens, in the most surprising way, that the networks that are repoliticising working class people tend to be, at this point in time, around the household charges. Now, that doesn't mean it's a pure left campaign. It's got many populist dimensions to it. It's very mixed ideas, but in terms of its trajectory, it is to the left and is leading to a deeper politicisation. Fourth, I think the left needs to understand that this is only the start of it. This is only the start of the battle. It is the first episode of a bigger battle against austerity. And to be frank, compared to Spain, Greece, or Italy, or Portugal, Ireland's only at the very, very start of a battle, with general strikes in most other countries. I think that's crucial to understand that the household charges campaign has a dimension of a boycott, in many ways, in some ways, quite an individual response. You don't have to do anything, as some speakers made in the household campaign, simply boycott. In reality, the movement's going to go from there. It'll go from boycott to mass civil disobedience. And I think, for example, I've noticed a very interesting debate about the push through police lines at the Labour Party over, I think it was a week or so ago. I thought it was magnificent. It was magnificent because it wasn't led by the left. It was led by 50, 60-year-old working class people, quite spontaneously, in a peaceful way, doing what people do naturally in protest, push through police lines to get to a conference. Basic stuff, right? But of course the media present that as terrible violence and so on, and some people buckle under. The left must learn to stand with people when they move to civil disobedience, basic stuff. I think also the left needs to understand that in this situation, you have to make a link. I believe organised workers are crucial to change, but given the level of social partnership, the level of dislocation of the organised workers movement, there's going to have to be a fusion between a social movement, in this case the bigger one is on household charges, on water taxes, but it could be other social movements, people organising against the closure of deaf schools, a fusion between those movements and organised workers. And I think the initiatives on May Day, the attempt, for example, to revive May Day, is important. I think that the call of the Dublin Council of Trade Unions to have a march with the community groups, with in my view, the better sections of the Occupy movement, with the organised left, this is the way we have to go. I think that's really what has happened in America, and it needs to be brought to Ireland. And lastly, I think that the left have to understand that the mood of many people who are beginning to resist is not simply for abstract propagandism. It's not for, we will overthrow capitalism and here is the socialist programme. I think that's not where it's at. It's about making very clear and very, very concrete demands, targeting the wealthy, but pointing out to people that in order to achieve even the most moderate demands, it's going to take you up against the limits of capitalism. And in that sense, I think that Connolly put it beautifully. He says, our demands, most modest are, we only want to hurt. We start off with very modest demands, but they lead into a battle against capitalism itself in the current situation.